Hi, my name is Miranda Nicusanti, and I'm a media arts production major at Emerson College. And in my free time, I'm a portrait, concert, and lifestyle photographer. I've been shooting for about 4 years now, and as an Emerson student, I got onto some of my first sets as a BTS photographer. It's a great role to immerse yourself in the world of student filmmaking and learn a lot. Today, we'll be talking about some of the basics of photography and on-set BTS photography specifically. So let's start out by talking about gear. This is my camera. It's a Canon EOS R with a 24-70mm f2.8, and don't worry, that will all make sense very soon. This is my standard camera setup for anything pretty much, so either portrait, concert, lifestyle, even landscape on occasion. This is my go-to camera. If you're just getting started in photography, I deeply recommend looking at the Canon T7i. It's an incredible camera to get you started in the world of photography. It's what's known as a crop sensor camera, which means whatever lens you attach will get multiplied by a factor of 1.5. Meaning if you're using a 50mm lens, it will function more so like a 75mm lens. So the lens you choose has a really large impact on your images. And there are two primary types of lenses called fixed or zoom lenses. A zoom lens has a range of focal lengths, whereas a fixed lens has a specific and unchangeable focal length. And from there are three primary categories of focal lengths. A wide angle lens is anything less than 35mm, a standard lens is anywhere between 35 and 85mm, and a telephoto lens is 85mm and up. So a 50mm lens is what's closest to what the natural eye sees. Every photographer will have their lens preferences, especially when it comes to a fixed prime lens. Most photographers typically favor a 35, 50, or 85mm, depending on their shooting style and what type of distortion they typically like in their images. So next we're going to be talking about the basics of manual photography. I'm a big believer in using your tech in whichever way you feel is most conducive to your creative process, but I think learning to shoot in manual mode is a great way to have more control over your images. Manual photography allows you to independently adjust three key exposure variables: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, which determine the overall brightness of your photos, as well as it affects the sharpness, depth of field, and overall quality of the image. Your ISO controls your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the noisier your photos become, meaning if you're shooting outside on a bright day and you want to reduce your exposure, you can drop the ISO to achieve a darker or more correctly exposed image, and vice versa. So if you're shooting at night and it's a little too dark, you can increase the ISO, but you have to remember how it affects the noise in the image. Next, we're going to talk about aperture. Aperture is an opening in the lens, and the wider the aperture, the more light it lets in, and the brighter the image becomes. Aperture can get a bit confusing given how people speak about it. The wider the aperture, the lower the f-stop value. The aperture is also responsible for controlling the depth of field, basically the amount of an image that's in focus. The larger the aperture, the smaller the depth of field. Shutter speed is the amount of time an image is exposed. So quite simply, it's how long the shutter stays open, allowing the light to hit the sensor. The faster the shutter speed, the less light is let in. So you'd want to typically use a faster shutter speed if you were trying to capture action or a lot of motion, but you can also make the artistic choice to have a lower shutter speed. The last key part of manual photography is white balance. I typically leave my camera in auto white balance mode, but I still think it's important to understand the Kelvin scale. The lower the number, the warmer the image, and the higher the number, the cooler or bluer the image will be. So now that you know all the vocab, how do you actually apply this? When going to shoot, I typically start out by setting my aperture. For portraiture, I aim to have my f-stop as low as possible to create a sense of depth within the image. It also makes it a little bit more visually interesting and blurs out the background. There are also times in which I prioritize my shutter speed. Generally, I try to keep it minimally at 1/100th, but you can definitely have a lower shutter speed as long as you're conscious of how you're holding and maneuvering your camera. In terms of ISO, I aim for about 400 to 800, except in certain low light situations in which my ISO has been as high as 10,000. Your ISO will also impact your image differently depending on what type of camera you own. So just a couple tips and tricks that I definitely recommend when starting in photography. Number one is to always shoot in RAW. By shooting it in RAW, it captures extra data, which means when you put your image into Lightroom, Photo Mechanic, or whatever editing software you prefer, that you're able to recover shadows and highlights without bringing in grain or noise that is typically associated with high ISO. As an on-set BTS photographer, it's your job to try and capture the crew specifically. You're there developing marketing materials for the film to eventually use, so it can be extremely helpful if you're able to have a brief discussion with the film's executive producers or marketing director to align your vision with their own. On set, make sure that you are not taking photos during takes that could potentially delay production. People are already stressed about time, so as a BTS photographer, try not to add on to that stress. Occasionally, you may be asked to take portraits of the primary cast for promotional purposes, but yet again, that's something to communicate with the project's creative leads about ahead of time. In regards to editing, tailor your style to the needs of the production. Maintain your distinct visual style as a photographer, but if you're working on a period piece, maybe consider adding in a little bit more grain or catering to a specific color palette that fits the film's aesthetic. In regards to editing and photography in general, a lot of the images you create lose their relevancy the longer that you hold on to them. So it's super important to give back your photos in a timely manner. Typically, I try to get my photos back within 2 to 7 days, but the quicker you send them back, the more the production will love you. BTS photography is a great way to learn more about filmmaking and practice your skills on set. If you want to learn more about photography in general, I highly recommend watching videos from YouTube creators like Peter McKinnon and Mango Street to learn more. So get out there and start shooting.